2 days ago, the world woke up to news that the United States and Israel had launched a massive military operation against Iran. The official story was this: Operation Epic Fury targeted Iranian military infrastructure, missile sites, naval assets, air defense systems, military command centers, a bold, decisive military operation to neutralize an existential threat. That was the story on Saturday morning. Here's what we now know the story actually was. The CIA had been secretly tracking Ayatollah Ali Khamenei for months, not weeks, months, building intelligence on his movements, mapping his patterns, learning where he went, when he went there, and, most critically, when he would be vulnerable. And then the CIA learned something that changed everything. On Saturday morning, February 28th, 2026, Khamenei would be present at a specific compound in the heart of Tehran. Not just Khamenei, roughly 40 of Iran's most senior officials would be gathered in that same location for a rare high-level meeting. The Minister of Defense, the head of intelligence, the Supreme Leader's top security advisor, the commander of the IRGC, the most powerful people in the Iranian regime, all in one place at one time. The CIA passed that intelligence to Israel, described by officials as offering high fidelity on Khamenei's exact position. And the United States and Israel did something that tells you everything about what this operation actually was. They changed the plan. The original operation was designed to launch under cover of darkness. When the CIA intelligence came in, when that window of opportunity opened, American and Israeli military officials moved the entire attack, from nighttime to daytime. From a broad military strike to a precisely timed, intelligence-driven operation aimed at achieving what officials described as a critical and early victory, the elimination of the top leadership of the Iranian regime. This was not a military operation that happened to kill Khamenei. This was an assassination operation, planned and executed with CIA intelligence, that was dressed in the clothing of a military strike. And Congress, the body that the Constitution gives the authority to declare war, had no idea. What I just described to you is not a theory. It is not speculation. It is sourced reporting from the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, two of the most credible investigative news organizations in the world, based on people familiar with the operation and officials briefed on the intelligence. And almost nobody is explaining what it actually means. That is what Senate Decode is here for. We are going to break down the full covert operation story, what the CIA knew, when they knew it, what they did with it, and what the legal and constitutional consequences of this revelation are, in plain English, without spin. Hit subscribe right now, because this story is going to drive congressional investigations for months, and you want to understand every chapter as it develops. Let's get all the way into it. Let's start with what the reporting actually says, because the details here are extraordinarily important. According to the New York Times, citing people familiar with the operation and officials briefed on the intelligence, the CIA had been tracking Supreme Leader Khamenei for months, gaining more confidence about his locations and his patterns. Read that again. Months. This was not a last-minute opportunity. This was a sustained, long-term intelligence operation targeting the head of state of a sovereign nation. The agency built what officials described as high-fidelity intelligence on Khamenei's position, meaning they were not guessing about where he was. They had specific, reliable, real-time information about his location and his movements. Then came the critical moment. The CIA learned that a meeting of top Iranian officials would take place on Saturday morning at a leadership compound in central Tehran. This was a compound that housed the offices of the Supreme Leader, the Iranian presidency, and the Supreme National Security Council, essentially the nerve center of the entire Iranian government. Senior national security officials were in one building. Khamenei was in another nearby structure. And according to an Israeli defense official whose message was reviewed by the New York Times, the strike was carried out simultaneously at several locations in Tehran, achieving what the official called tactical surprise, despite the fact that Iran had been preparing for a possible attack for weeks. Think about what that means. Iran knew a strike might be coming. They were on high alert. And the CIA's intelligence was so precise, so current, and so carefully protected that Iran had no idea the attack was being timed to coincide with this specific meeting. The CIA passed all of this to Israel, and when that intelligence arrived, American and Israeli officials made a decision that is now at the center of one of the most significant legal and constitutional debates in a generation. They moved the entire operation. The original plan was a nighttime attack. The CIA intelligence created a daylight window, a brief opportunity to hit the entire Iranian leadership in one place at one time, and officials took it. The result? Khamenei dead. Roughly 40 senior Iranian officials killed in the same strikes. The Minister of Defense, the head of intelligence, the IRGC commander, the Supreme Leader's security advisor, Iran's armed forces chief of staff. the most consequential decapitation strike against a foreign government in the history of American covert operations. Now let's talk about who knew what in Washington, because this is where the constitutional and political story gets incredibly important. We know from the White House's own photograph, released on their official social media, that President Trump was at Mar-a-Lago when the operation launched. The photo shows Trump at a table with a group of senior officials monitoring the operation in real time. In that photograph, you can identify some of the most powerful people in the U.S. national security apparatus: CIA Director John Ratcliffe, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Secretary of War Pete Hegseth, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Dan Kane, White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles. These are the people who were in the room. Now, here's the question that this photograph and the CIA intelligence reporting raises in the most direct possible way. If the CIA had been tracking Khamenei for months, if the intelligence was precise enough to move an entire military operations timeline, then the decision to use that intelligence to target and kill the supreme leader of Iran was made well before Saturday morning. It was made in a room somewhere, by people with authority, at some point during those months of surveillance. When was that decision made? Who made it? Was it a covert action finding? The formal presidential authorization required by law before the CIA can conduct covert operations, including targeted killings? Was Congress notified? Because the law, specifically the National Security Act and the Intelligence Authorization Act, requires the president to notify the Gang of Eight of significant covert actions, not after the fact, before or during. These are not abstract legal questions. They are the specific questions that congressional oversight committees are now asking, and the answers, whatever they turn out to be, will define the legal framework for how American presidents can use CIA intelligence to target foreign leaders for the rest of this century. Here's the word that official Washington is very carefully not using right now: assassination. Ever since President Gerald Ford signed Executive Order 11905 in 1976, an order that was strengthened by subsequent presidents and is still in effect today, the United States has had an official policy prohibiting the assassination of foreign leaders. The order, now codified as Executive Order 12333, states clearly that no person employed by or acting on behalf of the United States government shall engage or conspire to engage in assassination. That is the law. It has been on the books for 50 years. Now, the government has legal arguments for why what happened on Saturday does not constitute assassination under that order. The primary argument is that Khamenei was not targeted as an individual in a peacetime covert operation. He was targeted as the commander of an enemy military force during what the administration describes as an armed conflict. Under the laws of armed conflict, killing enemy commanders, including heads of state who exercise military command authority, is legally permissible. That argument has legal grounding. It is not invented. International law does recognize the targeting of military commanders during armed conflict as a lawful act of war. But here's the problem with that argument in this specific case. The United States Congress has not declared war on Iran. There has been no authorization for use of military force passed by Congress specifically authorizing this operation. The administration notified 7 of the 8 members of the Gang of Eight, the bare minimum congressional notification required for covert operations, and launched the strikes anyway. If this is an armed conflict, if that is the legal justification for targeting Khamenei, then the constitutional requirement for congressional authorization of that armed conflict applies, and that authorization does not exist. If this is not an armed conflict and if it was a covert operation, then the executive order prohibiting assassination may apply, and that prohibition was not waived by any public legal finding. The administration is trying to occupy a legal space between those two categories, treating the operation as a military strike for purposes of avoiding the assassination prohibition while avoiding the declaration of war requirement by calling it a covert action. Legal scholars are already tearing that argument apart, and Congress is now building the case for hearings. Let's talk about CIA Director John Ratcliffe, because his presence in that Mar-a-Lago photograph is one of the most significant details in this entire story. Ratcliffe is not just the director of the CIA, he is the nation's chief intelligence officer. His signature, or more precisely, the president's signature on a covert action finding that Ratcliffe would have helped prepare, is what legally authorizes the CIA to conduct operations like the one that targeted Khamenei. The fact that Ratcliffe was physically present at Mar-a-Lago during the operation, watching it unfold in real time alongside Trump, tells you that the CIA's role in this was not peripheral. It was central. The intelligence agency was not providing background information to a military operation. It was an active participant in a coordinated strike that it had helped plan and time. That is a significant distinction. Military strikes are authorized and conducted under one legal framework. CIA covert operations are authorized and conducted under a different legal framework, one that has specific congressional notification requirements, specific presidential authorities, and specific limitations. The reporting from the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal makes clear that the CIA's intelligence was not just used to support the operation, it triggered the operation. The timing change from night to day happened because of CIA intelligence. The specific targeting of Khamenei's location happened because of CIA intelligence. That means the CIA's involvement was not supplementary, it was decisive. And that means every legal question about covert action authorization, congressional notification, and the executive order on assassination applies directly to what happened on Saturday morning in Tehran. Here is something that has been almost completely buried in the avalanche of breaking news from the last 48 hours, and it is arguably the most important piece of context for understanding why this operation happened when it did. 2 days before Operation Epic Fury launched, on Thursday, February 26, 2026, the United States and Iran held their third round of indirect nuclear negotiations in Geneva. Those talks ended with no resolution. Let that sink in for a second. 2 days before the United States launched a military operation aimed at regime change in Iran, 2 days before the CIA's intelligence triggered the decision to move the attack timeline, American and Iranian diplomats were sitting across a table in Switzerland trying to negotiate a deal over Iran's nuclear program. The CIA was tracking Khamenei during those negotiations. American intelligence officials knew where he was, what his patterns were, and when he would be vulnerable, while American diplomats were in the same room as Iranian officials discussing a diplomatic path forward. Trump himself said publicly that the negotiations had failed, that Iran had rejected every opportunity to renounce its nuclear ambitions. He used the failure of diplomacy as the justification for military action. But the timeline raises a question that nobody has fully answered. Was the diplomatic track ever genuinely intended to succeed, or was it always a parallel process? Negotiations in Geneva, CIA tracking in Tehran, running simultaneously toward an outcome that had already been decided? That question is not a conspiracy theory. It is a legitimate inquiry into how American foreign policy was actually being conducted in the weeks before the most significant military operation of the Trump presidency. Al Jazeera's correspondent in Washington noted that Trump was setting the table for a revolution in Iran and drew a specific historical parallel. 73 years ago, the CIA orchestrated a coup against Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. This time, the correspondent observed, they were doing it with weapons and bombs rather than purely through covert means. That parallel, whether you find it illuminating or unfair, is one that the world outside the United States is already making, and it matters for how American credibility is perceived in every future diplomatic negotiation with every other nation on the planet. Let's be real about where the congressional response stands, because there is a significant gap between the outrage being expressed and the power that Congress actually has to do something about it. Senator Bernie Sanders called the operation illegal, premeditated, and unconstitutional, a war launched without congressional authorization. He pointed directly to the Constitution's text, giving Congress, not the president, the power to declare war. The War Powers Resolution introduced by Representative Massey and Representative Khanna is still moving forward. House Democrats are pushing for a floor vote as soon as next week. But here's the reality of congressional war powers in 2026. The War Powers Resolution, the law passed in 1973 specifically to limit presidential war-making authority after Vietnam, has never successfully stopped a president from conducting military operations. Every president since Nixon has argued in one form or another that the War Powers Resolution is an unconstitutional infringement on executive authority, and because the courts have consistently refused to adjudicate the dispute, the executive branch has been able to conduct military operations for decades without meaningful congressional constraint. The Gang of Eight notification requirement for covert actions is real, but as we discussed, notification is not authorization. 7 of the 8 were told before the strikes. They had no vote. They had no veto. What Congress does have, and what it is now building toward, is the power of investigation and the power of the purse. The House and Senate Intelligence Committees can subpoena witnesses, demand documents, and hold public hearings. They can compel testimony from CIA Director Ratcliffe, Secretary of State Rubio, and potentially even members of the National Security Team who were in that Mar-a-Lago room. They can put the legal justifications for the operation on the record and put the people who made those justifications under oath. And Congress can, if it chooses, use the appropriations process to withhold funding for the continued operation, a power that is constitutionally unambiguous and has been used in the past to end American military interventions abroad. Whether the current Congress has the political will to use those tools is a separate question, but the tools exist, and the CIA's role in targeting Khamenei, now publicly reported, has given the oversight committees exactly the factual predicate they need to launch serious, sustained investigations. Let's look at what Trump himself has said publicly about the CIA's role, because his own words are extraordinary. In his Truth Social post confirming Khamenei's death, Trump wrote, "He was unable to avoid our intelligence and highly sophisticated tracking systems, and working closely with Israel, there was not a thing he or the other leaders that have been killed along with him could do." Read that carefully. Our intelligence and highly sophisticated tracking systems. The President of the United States publicly confirmed in a social media post that American intelligence, CIA intelligence, was used to track and target the supreme leader of Iran. He did not say, Israel hit him. He said, our intelligence tracked him. Our systems found him. That is the president himself confirming the CIA's central role in the operation. He also told NBC News that the attacks had inflicted tremendous damage and that Iran would be calling him to ask who he would like as their next leader, adding, with what he called only a little sarcasm, that he was already thinking about it. And he told CBS News that the remaining Iranian regime officials should agree to a diplomatic solution because it was much easier now than it was a day ago, obviously, because they are getting beat up badly. He was also offering immunity to IRGC members who surrendered, while warning that those who didn't would face death. This is the language of regime change, not military deterrence, not counterproliferation, not a targeted response to an imminent threat. The President of the United States, the day after an operation in which the CIA helped kill the supreme leader of Iran, was publicly negotiating the terms of that regime's surrender and discussing who he would like as Iran's next leader. That is an extraordinary statement of intent, and it is happening without a declaration of war, without congressional authorization, and with a CIA covert operation at its foundation that the American public only learned about through investigative journalism, not through any official disclosure. Let me bring all of this together. Here is what we now know. The CIA spent months tracking Ayatollah Khamenei, building intelligence on his location, his patterns, his movements, preparing for a moment of opportunity. When that moment arrived, a rare Saturday morning meeting of the Iranian regime's top 40 officials, all in one compound, the CIA passed high-fidelity intelligence to Israel, and the United States and Israel changed their entire operation to take advantage of it. Roughly 40 of Iran's most senior officials were killed, Khamenei among them, the most consequential decapitation strike in American intelligence history. Congress was not meaningfully consulted. The assassination ban was not publicly addressed. The legal framework has not been publicly explained, and the president has confirmed, in his own words on social media, that American intelligence was at the center of it all. This is not a military story anymore. It is a covert operation story, a constitutional story, a story about the limits of presidential power and the role of the CIA in American foreign policy that is going to be argued, investigated, and litigated for years. And the American public, whose tax dollars fund the CIA, whose representatives sit in Congress, whose sons and daughters serve in the military that is now engaged in active combat operations in the Middle East, deserves to understand exactly what was done in their name and exactly what the legal and constitutional basis for it was. That is what Senate Decode is here for. If this video helped you understand something that the breaking news alerts are not explaining, share it right now. Send it to someone who needs to understand the full picture. Drop a comment and tell me what question you still need answered. What part of this story you want us to go deeper on, because there is more to come. The congressional hearings are coming. The legal challenges are coming. The full story of what the CIA knew and when they knew, it is still unfolding. And we will be here every single step of the way, breaking it all down for you in plain English. Hit subscribe if you haven't already. This is the channel that asks the questions nobody else is asking. This is Senate Decode. I'll see you in the next one.